Now, here's a slightly different way to think about the original position that isn't exactly what Rawls says, but it really helps me to think clearly about the key ideas. So suppose you know, one, that this kind of quote unquote constitutional convention was coming up, right? That is, you knew that your society was ready for some big changes and you were about to choose principles of distribution. Okay? And suppose you also knew that, two, each person in society, including you, had to hire a lawyer to represent them at the convention, right? You don't represent yourself at the convention, you have a lawyer that represents you instead. And suppose that you also know, three, that your lawyer, whoever you choose, does not know anything about you personally, although they know all general information about people, society, and so on. Right? Your lawyer's job, everyone's lawyer's job, is just to get the best deal possible for their client. Right? That's it. It's the only consideration. But they don't know who their client is. Right? That's the sticky bit. In this situation, the final part of this puzzle is that everyone's lawyer would have to deliberate about and then decide on principles that would be rationally acceptable to everyone, since their client could be anyone. All right? So if you imagine the scenario like this, right? Your lawyer has to get the best deal for you possible, but he doesn't know exactly who you are, he doesn't know any particular facts about you, then you could start to see, in thinking about the lawyer's decision-making process, why the principles that he would choose or she would choose or they would choose would be principles that would have to be rationally acceptable to everyone, right? So they'd have to be able to justify their choices to their client, whoever their client is. Okay, now that's Rawls's basic case for premise 3. That is, for the first part of his explanation of how we should understand premise 2. Right? What principles can we rationally agree to? Well, it's whatever principles we could agree to in the original position as described. Now, hopefully, you're at least a little bit impressed with it. Right? This is a very cool procedure, right? At least in my humble opinion. And we'll see how cool it is when we talk about the principles that might be accepted in just a second. Now, Rawls gives a slightly fancier argument for premise 3 that I think is really important for us to look at. He says, assuming that the original position does determine a set of principles, it will then be true that whenever social institutions satisfy these principles, those engaged in them can say to one another that they are cooperating on terms to which they would agree if they were free and equal persons whose relations with respect to one another were fair. Right? Here you should pause this and reread that to yourself several times because it's just so important. That's the deep argument for premise 3. All right, continuing, and this is all equally important. No society can, of course, be a scheme of cooperation which men enter voluntarily in a literal sense. Each person finds himself placed at birth in some particular position in some particular society, and the nature of this position materially affects his life prospects. Yet a society satisfying the principles of justice as fairness comes as close as a society can to being a voluntary scheme. For it meets the principles which free and equal persons would assent to under circumstances that are fair. In this sense, its members are autonomous and the obligations they recognize self-imposed. Right? This paragraph is just as important as anything in Rawls's entire body of work. Right? These are the reasons that we should kind of favor his basic methodology. Right? Because this is the way to kind of come closest to figuring out how we would relate to each other if we were free and equal and our relations to one another were fair. Right? Very, very important. Okay, so now, finally, we've arrived at the really meaty substantive stuff. Right, so now we understand premise 2, and we understand premise 3. Why does Rawls think that the principles laid out A and B as part of 4 are the only principles we could rationally agree to. Well, let's look at each principle in turn. The first principle, remember, says that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive basic liberty compatible with a similar liberty for others. Okay, now why is it rational to insist on this principle? Well, first, here's some more info about what A actually amounts to. Like, what are these basic liberties? The basic liberties of citizens are, roughly speaking, political liberty, that is, the right to vote and to be eligible for public office, together with freedom of speech and assembly. They're also liberty of conscience and freedom of thought, freedom of the person along with the right to hold personal property, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure as defined by the concept of the rule of law. These liberties are all required to be equal by the first principle, since citizens of a just society are to have the same basic rights. Okay, so that's the idea. These are the basic liberties that we would all want as many of as we could have as possible. So why, though, would we insist on A exactly as is? Well, the basic idea, as I understand it, is that these rights and liberties, the ones Rawls just listed, are essential to basically any kind of life one might want to lead, right? Whether we're religious or not, whether we're rich or poor, whether we kind of are deeply social or we're more kind of, we prefer to be on our own, right? Whatever kind of life we want to lead, right? We would want all of these liberties to the maximum degree possible, right? Because we couldn't live freely without them. But since we, or our lawyer in the original position, doesn't actually know who we are or will be, it turns out that we can rationally acknowledge limitations on our rights and liberties. Namely, since we could not rationally accept others being able to violate our rights and liberties, we can rationally give up our ability to violate others' rights or liberties. But if our lawyer gave up our rights or liberties for any other reason, we'd reasonably be very pissed off at our lawyer, right? Thinking about like our lawyer in the original position, they should, given that they don't know who their client would be, it seems like principle A would be very reasonable for them to insist on, right? Because we all want as many liberties as possible, but since the lawyer doesn't know who we'll be, we can only insist on as many liberties as we can get without those liberties being violated for other people. So that's what A says. Just a quick note here before we move on personal versus private property. So in this passage, Rawls talks about personal property being a kind of fundamental right that we would all insist on. Now, there's a distinction made, at least in the socialist tradition, between personal property and private property. Right? Private property is essentially related to capitalism, whereas personal property is not, at least in theory. Now, I don't want to get too deep in the weeds here, but we'll discuss this a bit more in coming weeks. But if you're interested right now in this distinction, here's a very short, recent, fairly comprehensible treatment of this distinction. Okay, just linked to there on the PowerPoint. So check that out if you're curious. But just to be clear here, Rawls is not stipulating that one of the basic liberties that we would all insist on is private property. It's rather this weaker notion of personal property. Right? Personal property is stuff for personal use, not property. I'm not going to go into it any farther. We'll talk more about this later. Okay, so commenters on Rawls generally seem pretty okay with principle A. So now let's move on to the much more interesting principle B. Now, principle B has two parts, as you can see, right? Part 1 and part 2. Now, not all of principle B is that interesting. Principle B's part 2, maybe not that interesting either. What it says, I'll give you a second to read it. Right, what part 2 of principle B says is that we couldn't rationally agree to inequalities that would be generated by different positions to which people didn't have equal access. Okay? And that, I think, to most people, or most Americans anyway, seems very plausible. Right, again, think back to your lawyer in the original position. If your lawyer agreed to a deal that said, you can get all the best jobs, but only if you're a white man, right, it would be rational for you to be extremely upset, right, since your lawyer should have been much more cautious, since he had no reason whatsoever to think that you would or wouldn't be a white man, right? It would be crazy to not ensure that all positions and offices that could generate inequalities were open to everybody equally, right, and realistically. So that's the kind of the motivation for part 2 of Principle B. Right? So part 2 of Principle B also seems pretty solid and straightforward. But things get tricky here. So if you're interested in what fair equality of opportunity actually amounts to, you should reread these parts of the Rawls. Right? It's very interesting, and he has a lot of helpful stuff to say.